speak today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians, both of the land on which I wrote the paper and on which I'm now presenting it. So the origins of the Vernon report, and you can see I brought a prop with me here, was announced by Prime Minister Menzies in October of 1962. So that was shortly after the 1961 election, which was had proved almost terminal, and that was because of the famous credit squeeze recession that happened that year. And so Menzies, I think, felt a need to see how economic policy could be improved. It had been criticised in the 50s for stop-go policies. So he felt a need to either find a way of improving economic policy or to look as though he was at least trying to find a way to improve economic policy. And so there'd been many people, particularly McEwen and the Country Party, who'd been calling for an inquiry into economic management and maybe an update of the review of tariffs. And it was a time globally when economic planning was getting more attention. So the UK was setting up NEDI, France was moving towards economic planning. There were academics in Australia arguing for it. Heinz Art was putting the point a little bit too strongly when he said that everybody in Australia, other than the government and the Treasury, wanted economic planning introduced, but there was certainly a lot of people who did. So Menzies announced the establishment of this inquiry and chose 5 people to be the members. Now, I've promised Nick I won't say too much about Jack Crawford because he's about to talk about that gentleman. But Crawford had been one of the people who had been arguing for a long while for an inquiry into economic management. Menzies wanted to make Crawford the chair. Cabinet wasn't keen on that. They didn't want a public servant or a former public servant as the chair. So James Vernon, head of CSR, became the chair. Crawford was the deputy. Also on the committee were Peter Carmel, an academic, Ken Meyer, the head of the eponymous retail chain, and Dudsley Molesworth, the sort of invisible man that I couldn't find a picture of, who was head of a meat processing company. I was very interested early today when we heard from Professor Blaney about how Menzies had stressed a role for women in the Victorian Liberal Party, and we just heard from Selwyn about Menzies wanting a woman on the committee looking at decimal currency. So it was interesting at the lack of diversity in the people he appointed to this committee. They were all essentially middle-aged white men, and they were all either academics or business leaders. So there's not much diversity there. So you won't probably be able to read this, but this is the terms of reference. And the point I'm really just trying to make with this slide is that they were very long. Almost every aspect of the economy you can think of is sort of listed there. So it was always going to be a long inquiry and producing a large volume. So a couple of people have claimed that it's 1 million words long. I haven't counted it myself, but it's not impossible. So you had the main report itself is 450 pages, but that wasn't enough. There's another volume of appendices. And if you look at it, it's in very small type. So there are an awful lot of words in it. I started off with the ambition of reading the whole thing. I got through the first volume. I must admit I was skimming by the time I got to the second volume. So what has it got in it? Well, the main volume starts off with essentially an economic history of the Australian economy post-war, so from about 45 to 63. It then goes chapter by chapter through all the things that were in the terms of reference. Then you've got, as I said, this other volume of appendices. The most important one is the medium-term projections, and I'll talk about them in a moment. Surprisingly to me, even in these large volumes, they don't have a sort of concise summary of their main conclusions or recommendations. You've got to sort of hunt through looking for them. And that probably made it easier for critics to just ignore a lot of recommendations. I've got a written version of the paper which goes into more detail on the economic recommendations and the responses to them, so anyone who's keen can pick that up. But to summarise some of them, it's essentially a Keynesian framework, so it notes the fact that since the Second World War, while there had been economic fluctuations, they were nowhere near the magnitude that we'd seen in the 1930s or the 1890s or the 1840s for that matter. And it notes that when the economy started to slow down, governments responded in a Keynesian way. When the economy started to overheat, governments responded in a Keynesian way, and is broadly supportive of that. So this was being written in the 1960s, arguably the high point of confidence in Keynesian macroeconomic management. It refers to full employment, and unlike the government's recent white paper, it puts a number on it, which is 1 to 1.5% unemployment rate, which now, of course, seems incredibly ambitious when you have to go back to 1971 to find an unemployment rate that low in Australia. They talk about the Arbitration Commission and say they should put more emphasis on price stability in their deliberations. They talk about immigration, but they're a bit agnostic on that. They say on the one hand, having more people come in means we can produce more. On the other hand, we do need more capital equipment for them. We need houses for them. We need schools and hospitals for them. So immigration definitely helps the immigrants. The impact on the people who were here before they came, it's a bit more ambiguous. They talk about fiscal and monetary policy, and they see fiscal policy as being the more potent tool of economic management, which is probably the consensus view at the time. We hadn't had the sort of reforms to the financial system and the changes to the conduct of the Reserve Bank, which would make monetary policy have more potency. Interestingly, from a perspective reading it now, are some of the things that don't get a mention. So there's no discussion about floating the exchange rate, for example. They talk about the exchange rate moving from one peg to another, but not floating it. And similarly, there's almost no discussion of deregulation, either in financial markets, so there's no question about making interest rates more flexible and so on, but also the Arbitration Commission is taken for granted, and there's no real discussion about moving to a much more flexible labour market. On tariffs, they think the existing tariffs were beneficial, but probably a bit too complex. And they emphasised that effective rates of protection would be a better way of analysing tariffs. They thought Australia could do with a bit more research and development, and that would probably require more spending on higher education. So one of the interesting things in the appendices was the medium-term projections. And there was some confusion about what these were actually meant to be. So were they extrapolations? Were they projections? Were they forecasts? Were they aspirations? Or were they targets? And the term that they use is projections. So they're something which they thought the economy could achieve with good management. So it's more than just an extrapolation. So over the previous decade, the economy had been growing about 4% a year. The committee felt it could grow at about 5% a year if immigration was kept up. There wasn't another recession. Productivity continued on similar trends, and we increased our savings and investment a bit. So it was something to aspire to, maybe one way of putting it. The numbers up on the screen there, I hope you can read. And what struck me when I look at this was how accurate those projections were compared to what actually happened. So they actually got it really, really close to right. Real GDP grew by something quite close to the 5% they were talking about. And even the components they got pretty much right. They got consumption, investment right. They understated exports a bit. That was offset by understating imports as well. So they did make some clear recommendations. So they wanted an inquiry into the monetary system, which there hadn't been since 1936. And they one would have to wait a while for that to happen. So you had the Campbell Committee in the late 70s, early 80s, and then you had the review of the Reserve Bank last year. They also wanted what could be regarded as a permanent version of the committee, so an advisory council on economic growth, as had recently been introduced in Canada. Again, you had to wait a while for something like that. The EPAC, introduced under the Hawke government, which has since been subsumed into the Productivity Commission, undertook some of that role. They also suggested a special projects commission that would look at ideas for public works, prioritise them, and apply a sort of a rigorous cost-benefit analysis to that. And I guess the Productivity Commission does some of that sort of work, but I think that's something we're still waiting on, really. So the report was handed down in 1965. So Menzies had originally said it would take a few months. It ended up taking a couple of years. It was unanimous. There was no dissenting reports or anything. Treasury had opposed the idea of the inquiry from the start, and they were very critical of it. A young John Stone was sort of sent out to talk to journalists and rubbish it. Treasury likes free markets and competition, with one exception. They don't like competition to their policy advice. And they really put the boot in on this occasion, and authored an extremely critical cabinet submission on it as well. Cabinet discussed it for quite a while, claimed they had more discussion on this report than they did about the 1966 budget. And it took the government quite a while to table it. So the government got the report in May. It wasn't until September it was tabled. And John McEwen thinks it wasn't a coincidence that happened while he was out of the country, because he was probably the one most supportive of it. Then Menzies gave a speech about it, and then the debate was adjourned. And it didn't actually get debated until March 1966. So it's almost a year after the report had been finished. And by then, Menzies had retired. And Harold Holt, who'd been the Treasurer and then was now the Prime Minister, never actually spoke on the report. So that also meant it got less attention than it might have otherwise. Interestingly, a young Bob Hawke, as appearing before the Arbitration Commission, called some of the committee members as witnesses at a basic wage case. So, as I said, Menzies gave a speech in the House when he tabled the report, and it was surprisingly scathing and critical, given that the committee had basically done what he told them to do. He felt that they'd gone too far in terms of recommending policies. He sort of patronised them a bit by saying we forgive them for that sort of thing. And he also said that the report was advocating a degree of planning and sort of control of the economy, which was completely unacceptable. And even John Howard thought Menzies was going too far there, because the report doesn't say that at all. I mean, it advocates for an advisory committee that would be advisory. It would be not forcing anything on government. And I'll read you a couple of sentences from what the report actually says. We do not, however, suggest anything in the nature of a national economic plan involving industry targets, as this would require elaborate machinery and a considerably higher degree of intervention in the economy than would be acceptable, and it would not be practicable. So they weren't advocating some sort of Soviet-style 5-year plan. So it was a bit of a straw man that Menzies was attacking here. So there was this, I think, not very well-based criticism, and a lot of the other recommendations in the report were just sort of ignored, not commented on at all. So that was rather disappointing. Why? That was one of the things that sort of puzzled me when I started working on this paper, and it still puzzles me a bit. I mean, Menzies, I think, never really was particularly interested in economics. That's certainly what people like Coombs have said. And Menzies himself has said, I'm no economist. Now, I'm aware that I'm in a room with people who are a lot more respected Menzies scholars than I am, so I would certainly welcome anybody if they want to disagree with that. But it seemed that economics wasn't a passion for Menzies. And so why did he set up the inquiry? Well, to be seen to be doing something after the 61 recession. By the time the report is tabled, he's had the 63 election, his political position is much stronger, the economy had been performing quite well over the next few years, and so there was no longer a need to be seen to be doing something about the economy, so he was no longer terribly interested in it. And as I said earlier, there had been strong opposition to it from Treasury. They got their Minister Holt to argue against it. William McMahon argued strongly against it in Cabinet. So it was easy for Menzies to just ignore it. Other people were quite critical of Menzies' attitude. So there's a poem by a Labor backbencher. The committee themselves were, not surprisingly, not happy at all about the response. So they initially considered making a joint statement. Vernon drafted up a statement and circulated amongst the committee, and they more or less agreed to it. But then a couple of days later, Vernon said he'd had second thoughts. So he'd showed some of his business colleagues this, and they said, look, mate, you're just picking a fight here. If you criticise Menzies' comments like that, he's going to come after you with all the eloquence of which he can muster, and this is not going to end well for you. And so Vernon decided not to issue a joint statement. Crawford was more miffed, though, and he gave a spirited defence of the report in a speech at the press club. And some of the other committee members sort of drafted that and basically didn't disagree with the substance of what he was saying, but said, tone it down a bit, please. So other responses, the economic record devoted a whole issue in which it seemed like almost every economist in the country gave their commentary. And there was a fair consensus, I thought, reading through them, that most economists said, well, I disagree with this point or disagree with that point, but overall, this is a substantial body of work that deserves to be treated with respect, taken seriously, and it's very impressive. So that was the views, I think, of the peers of Crawford and Carmel, that this had been a very serious body of work. So part of the attempt to discredit it by Treasury was claiming that it's riddled with mistakes and basic errors and so on. I don't think that criticism stands up. I mean, obviously, with a report of this length, there's probably going to be a couple of numbers in it that are wrong or something. But I think most of the criticisms that economists made were things that reasonable people could differ on. I would have assumed this rather than that. By the time the report comes out, some of the numbers were out of date and so on. But I don't feel the charge that this was sort of done incompetently stacks up at all. So, verdict of sort of history. The 40th and 50th anniversaries of the report were marked by some articles by Alex, but not by anybody else. And I suspect, unless Alex writes another piece, the 60th anniversary may only be marked by this paper. So I looked at Google's record of sort of citations of the report. Not surprisingly, it peaks when the report comes out. There's a bit of interest in it where in the mid-1970s, when the economic performance deteriorates, people went back to the report. Since then, it's sort of faded away. I think most students now would never have heard of it, and it's rarely spoken of. So I enjoyed the opportunity that this conference gave me to revisit it and maybe give it a bit more of the respect that I think it deserved. So thank you very much. Happy to try to answer questions.
Thanks, John. A couple of points. The volumes there remind me of the JFK, the Warren Commission, 10 volumes, 2 volumes there, mostly unread. The projections that you put up were very interesting because John Neville was involved in it, and he was he was the first economist to make an econometrician model of the Australian economy, and so his figures were very good. Other points was that Peter Carmel was very, very disappointed, according to Jeff Harcourt, that it was all rejected. The other point was that Heinz Arndt was extremely upset about it, and he and Downing had a whole issue of the economic record dedicated to 10 economists reporting on the Vernon report. It also was given great coverage in the Fin Review at the time. And then the last point was that the bit about effective protection, that Max Gordon, he was also involved. And that was part of the movement towards, the free trade crusade. But overall, and the other thing was Menzies' rejection of it, his parliamentary speech. I always thought that was written by John Stone. Is that correct?
I don't know. John Stone often claims to have written a lot of things, and there's some doubt about whether they were actually his work. The Hayden budget speech, for example, he claims it. So I don't know. On Heinz Arndt, yes, he was one of the strong defenders, and he wrote quite a few letters to the editor and articles and so on. In my view, credibly defending the report against some of the criticism of journalists. People like Maxwell Newton were putting the boot in, and they were sort of being fed by his old schoolmate, John Stone.
Thank you for reminding us of the Vernon report. There were, of course, apart from Treasury, strongly supportive voices of Menzies' response to the report. The Treasury, the report, as described by you in its sort of recommendations under cover, as it were, the recommendations waiting in the closet, could be seen as the high watermark of the Australian regulated economy, supported by the protectionist business sectors. And it certainly came out at a time when economic planning was in fashion. As you say, it had no thought of the deregulation of the labour market. In other words, it was really completely out of tune with the economic ideas that came from the Treasury, from John Stone and others, that became implemented and governed Australia right through from, you could say, I would say the last years of the Fraser government, but certainly into the Hawke-Keating government, and then were pretty well fully implemented by the Howard government as the high watermark of a government which is looking at a market economy, which the Vernon report certainly was not. And John Stone, if you like, was an early voice who produced or helped produce that liberalisation of economic policy. I know the Institute of Public Affairs in Victoria, of which my father was then director, was delighted at Menzies' response and very critical at the dirigist character of the Vernon report. So I just think it's useful to have in mind that the debate was, in fact, much more balanced. And the reason that Holt never, I think, gave a response to it and it was never properly debated in that way is because Menzies had finished it off. Menzies, pursuing his liberal philosophy, was very uncomfortable with its impact on how much role government would take from the Vernon report in directing resources to different industries in its effort to produce economic growth, and saw that it was really out of line with his philosophy, a philosophy which Sir John Crawford and others, of course, didn't support in the way that Menzies did.
Yeah, certainly the report doesn't advocate for liberalisation and the sorts of policies which you would admire. But I don't know that Menzies did all that much to deregulate either. I think the deregulation happened much later. On Max Corden, he, looking back in hindsight, he said he felt the chapter on tariffs was probably the only one that had some influence, and in particular the promotion of the idea of an effective rate of protection. At the time, Corden's view was that the Vernon report was protectionist, but he said probably less protectionist than the government and probably less protectionist than the Australian people as a whole. So that was his take on it at the time.
Okay, thanks very much, John. How did, if at all, state governments react to Vernon?
Not very much. In sort of reporting at the time, there's very little said by state governments. I didn't see much comment on that at all. The debate seemed to be taken up by people like Heinz Arndt and other economists, but not very much by state governments, as far as I could see.
Yeah, George, quickly.
You mentioned that Sir John McEwen was in favour of establishing the Vernon report and was suspicious that it was tabled when he was overseas. But he must have been a participant in the cabinet discussions about the Vernon report. It sounds to me from what you've said that Treasury took the lead in the cabinet debate. But in those days, Sir John McEwen didn't lose many arguments in cabinet about economic policy. So I wonder if I could ask you to expand a little more on his role in the reception of the Vernon report. And I mean, was this an occasion when McEwen lost the argument to Harold Holt or to William McMahon, indeed, who was the only man in that cabinet who had an economics degree? Was that one of the reasons that the relationship, particularly between McEwen and McMahon, became poisonous in the subsequent years?
I suspect it's one of only a number of reasons why the relationship between them became poisonous. But yes, it did appear to be a case where McEwen lost the debate in cabinet.
Yeah, I know there's more questions.
I think we're getting a wind-up call.
Yeah, but the second, thank you so much, John.